Aloha, everyone. It is Ajanette, and I am here to do your Chapter 9 lecture on late adulthood. So, we are now approaching the end stage of life and our last significant developmental period. We've already covered all of prenatal, infancy, childhood, and into early adulthood, middle adulthood, and now we're reaching late adulthood, which is about the mid 60s onward. So, when we're talking about late adulthood, it really is the longest developmental period. For some, it could cover 35 years or longer. For others, it's a little shorter depending upon your respective life expectancy. We do know that cohort, the baby boomer generation that we've referenced in earlier sections, those baby boomers are now aging, and consequently, we are going to have an aging population in the US, which then, of course, triggers greater need for healthcare workers, a greater need for long term care facilities, a greater need for more retirement enriching activities. And we have to think about financially what impact does that have on our economy, and how does that impact the financial viability of a huge segment of our population. So, as we are looking at late adulthood, we actually break this developmental period down into multiple segments because it does cover such a huge chunk of the lifespan. So, when we talk about those early years from that mid 60 to mid 70, we reference that as the young old period. 75 to 85 is old old. And then our oldest old are 85 plus. Once you reach 100, you're considered a centenarian. And it's important to note that, of course, risk of disease increases as we age. Cognitive decline continues to advance as we age. So there's certainly ramifications of such an extended life expectancy. And it is important to note that often the people that are aging obviously have some extraordinarily incredible genes. They tend to be, healthier in terms of their lifestyle and their physical health and well-being that has allowed them to endure for so long. But overall, when you talk about life expectancy, we kind of differentiate between lifespan, our maximum lifespan, which is really the period at which we as human beings are capable of living, right? And we're about 100 to 125 years in our maximum lifespan based on the science. When you talk about life expectancy, now we're talking about statistical probability. What is the likelihood that we will live? What is the average age at which people live? And in the US, it's just under 80 years of age. Now, for the World Health Organization, which extends well beyond the US, we can see that males have a significantly lower life expectancy than females, on average about 5 years, and that's across the globe. There's this really cool interactive graphic that I've listed here, and you can actually click, you can see the different patterns for the median age in the different regions for the different years, and it continues to kind of cycle up, and you can see how our aging trends have changed over the years. And what you'll see progressively, our world population is getting older. So we might actually see a period in time in demographics where our population levels decline and drop. And once that this new group of this new cohort of individuals pass through late adulthood and end up passing away, you might see a drop in the population numbers, and you might see a lower median age because you don't have as many elderly individuals pulling up those numbers. So when we talk about what's an average life expectancy, to be healthy, active. And we do see, again, that varies based on region. We are in a developed country, theoretically, where we have access to more resources, we have access to health care. All of that is theoretically supposed to increase our life expectancy. However, we will talk about some barriers and challenges as we progress through the lecture. So there's a number of different aging theories. There's the programmed theory, and really we're talking about your life expectancy is programmed into your DNA, to your genetics, to the human DNA, right? So based on those human chromosomes, we are programmed only to live a certain time. And as we mentioned, that maximum lifespan is 100 to 125. Certainly environmental factors, as we've talked about with epigenetics, can impact our gene expression and can impact how well biologically our genes are going through the process of cellular reproduction, repair, so on and so forth. So while there might be a maximum life expectancy programmed into our DNA, there's other extraneous factors that influence whether or not we can meet that life potential or not. There's also this concept of damage of error theories. And this is really focusing on kind of lifestyle factors, environmental factors, and how that accumulates within us genetically, biologically, whether that is the impacts of long-term stress exposure, that's from an epigenetic standpoint, that's modifying genes and impacting subsequent generations within our lineage, whether that is, a poor lifestyle and a lot of trauma and environmental risks exposed, that impact our individual life expectancy, as well as our potential then to now pass those barriers on to our genes and offspring moving forward. So genetics really are highly connected to life expectancy. Of course, we all have our genetic risk factors, our predispositions. So from a medical standpoint, even me and my cancer diagnosis, there was a genetic history done, and we looked at, who else in my family was diagnosed. They did genetic testing on me to see what kind of risk factors I had that I inherited, from my family. And then there's evolutionary theory, which presumably would suggest that life expectancy would be increasing, right? And that over time, the negative genetic variations are going to die off just from natural selection, and the more resilient, robust genetic variations are going to persist, right? But we know that's not the case because, cancer continues to expand, and our risks, that may not necessarily just be genetics, it might also be environmental exposure, right? It's also important to consider when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. And so maybe the rate by which we are corrupting ourselves environmentally, right, through contaminants and toxins and otherwise, is significantly faster, maybe lightning speed, compared to that of the survival of the fittest natural selection process. There's this cellular clock theory. So when you look at a DNA strand, we have limited reproductive ability. So those cells can only reproduce so many times, right? So they can only divide so many times. At the end of that DNA strand is what we call a telomere. And that telomere is basically kind of like extra genetic material that we can afford to lose and get rid of. So every time a cell replicates, it loses a little bit of that genetic material. Well, the DNA sequence and information is at the top, and then at the bottom is telomeres. Interestingly enough, research has shown that longer telomeres are associated with a longer life expectancy, um, because they have more excess material that they can afford to lose during that replication process. So telomeres end up being a protective factor for us genetically and through the process of cellular replication. And as it gets too short, right, then what happens is the cellular senescence happens. And that's when the cells, that replication just kind of turns off, right? And we tell our bodies we can no longer replicate. And so then there's also like just cell death, and that's what we call apoptosis. And then, of course, when you're talking about cancer, cancer cells will continue to replicate, continue to divide with that abnormal tissue. And so you have cellular growth, but it's mutated growth. And so that's where it can become detrimental to our bodily functions. Other aging theories talk about, damage to our DNA. So as we are exposed to different things in the world and the environment, such as me and my radiation, what that does is that deteriorates, that breaks down the cells, and they eventually don't function in the same healthy, adaptive way. And so consequently, that damage may manifest itself in disease, and which ultimately will impact my life expectancy, right? There's also mitochondrial damage. So mitochondrial DNA specifically is related to our energy. And, some of those cells die and decay, and consequently, we lose that mitochondrial protection, and we end up, of course, with a shorter life expectancy as a result. And then many of you may have heard of free radicals, right? And so as we're trying to produce energy in our bodies, we have these free radical cells that are missing an electron. So they're kind of like bullies on the playground, so to speak. They don't play well with the other cells and molecules in our body, and consequently, that instability damages our other cells and our other tissues, and it can increase our risk of disease and early death. And it's specifically associated with certain diseases, specifically cancer and others. Other theories of aging include the immune stress theory. And so think of the immune responses as an innate immune response that affects these organs, and an adaptive immune response that relies on these organs. And ultimately, those systems break down under stress. And so stress expedites that aging process. And we see this very commonly with a president, right? A new president comes in all bright and shiny, and when they leave office, they're grayed, right? They have aged significantly, and they carry the weight of the world on their shoulders, literally. And so that can be very stressful, and consequently, it might accelerate the aging process and potentially shorten life expectancy. Another theory that's similar and related to stress as well, but in this case, we think about that endocrine response and how cortisol levels increase during a high stress response, and those cortisol levels kind of shut down our natural immunity, and they have a long-term detrimental impact on our body and our metabolic functioning. And so this is specifically looking at the neuroendocrine response to the stress, rather than looking at the broader response to the different stress systems. Then, as we move into other aspects of physical development in this life period and developmental period, there is the Baltimore longitudinal study, which is one of the largest studies on aging. And of course, we know there's individual variations, right? So, in general, we see all of these changes taking place to our physical bodies over time. Now, you can have a young whippersnapper, right, that's older, that's still got a great heart muscle that looks like the heart of a 30-year-old. But in general, we expect these changes, which explains why you are at risk of greater diseases, of heart attack, of death as you age, right? Those risks increase with age. Other bodily changes is we start to put on weight, right? And we carry our weight around our middle. We tend to have more cellulite. We actually lose muscle over time. We lose bone loss and mass, and our bones deteriorate over time. This is particularly common among smaller framed women. It happens at faster rates. So you might see older women in particular, but men as well, encouraged to take supplements that help to strengthen their bone or do strength training to help not just maintain muscle mass, but also a strength training can help with their bone retention as well. You also see changes to the skin and hair. A lot of focus on these changes in the beauty industry, right? Multi-billion, trillion-dollar industry. And this is because our skin actively shows our aging, right? Through our wrinkles, the dry skin, the irritation, the redness, the brown spots that we get throughout our body, and of course, our increasing risk of skin cancers as well. And then you gotta love the sagginess and the wrinkles, fun stuff. And then sarcopenia, where we're talking about losing that muscle mass. My mom always said, like, every decade, expect some major changes. And this wasn't just from her education. This was from her experiencing significant shifts in her physical appearance and her physical strength and abilities and her physical health and her physical pain from each decade. And that makes sense because we lose about 3 to 5% of our muscle mass with each decade. And that starts at age 30. So cherish your youth, people. Cherish your youth. In addition to, our bodies changing, our sensory abilities change. So we are now at increased risk of diseases that impact our sight, our hearing, our taste, our smell, everything. So our sensory decline has a great impact on our quality of life, on our ability to socially engage the world. It's really not just about the physical decline, but the effects of that physical decline on our social and emotional health and well-being as well. Cataracts are one disease that impacts the eye. You can see the cloudy lenses. Now we have wonderful, accessible eye surgeries where they can take out your lens and replace it with a clear one, even a prescription one as well. But this actually the risk increases with age. Macular degeneration, where you literally see in the middle of your eye in that retinal space, you see it deteriorate. And these individuals, they can't cure macular degeneration, but they do injections directly into the eyeball that can help lessen the symptoms, slow down the degeneration. But ultimately, there's two different types, both of which can be detrimental for your vision and eventual vision loss altogether. Glaucoma is a pressure in the eye. Again, They do have treatments for relieving the pressure and that buildup of the fluid so they can drain it, but they're not necessarily curing the glaucoma. They're relieving a symptom, which then helps to curb the damage, because that pressure on your optic nerve can result in permanent nerve damage that impacts your vision as well. Beyond things that impact our eyeballs, our taste and smell can be impacted. So when we talk about presbyosmia, we're talking about the loss of smell due to aging. Anosmosia is total loss. And unfortunately, when we lose our smell, that impacts our taste buds, which can impact our health as well, right? So we gradually lose those sensory experiences, which may account for why some elderly people oversalt their food because they don't taste it, or why they're more capable of eating bland food because everything kind of loses that variety. So again, enjoy your youth, enjoy the different flavors of the world. And then hearing, of course, risks of hearing loss and reliance upon hearing aids increases with age. Sadly, there's a reluctance to actually utilize hearing aids, whether it is, a vanity thing, whether it's a stigma thing, but it's really important to understand the connection to our social well-being, because sometimes when we lose our hearing, we get excluded from conversations and social groups. It becomes more difficult for people to talk to us and with us, and for us to engage socially. And so hearing aids can be a wonderful tool to protect our psychological health and well-being through that sustained social engagement. Tinnitus is a ringing in the ear, and it continues, or the risk of that increases with age as well. And then sadly, we also have, depending upon, our lifestyle, our careers, what we've subjected our bodies to, and just our own DNA, we might also have greater risk of, chronic pain throughout our life, particularly as it relates to things like such as arthritis, or damage to your joints from different activities and careers as well. Ultimately, from a physical health standpoint, nutrition is important throughout life. And so, as I've shared with you, in different developmental periods, there is the My Plate that determines or recommends what percentage you should have of the different food categories. And so here is the breakdown for older adults. And it's important to understand how nutrition is not just related to our digestion, but our physical health, our immune system, and, believe it or not, our cognitive functioning. So really important to maintain a healthy diet. We'll talk about finances and how that might impact people's access as well. Here is a list of some of the most chronic conditions associated with the elderly populations, and you can see high cholesterol is something that is often managed with a healthy diet, diabetes, healthy diet, heart disease, healthy diet. Cancer can actually be positively impacted by a healthy diet, even arthritis and inflammation. By having a healthy diet, you can reduce your risk of inflammatory conditions. So healthy diet can help be a protective factor from all of these chronic conditions as well. Other chronic diseases to consider is, of course, cancer. Your risk starts to increase significantly with age. 65 seems to be the magic number. Again, enjoy your youth. And keep in mind that as you age, and you might be diagnosed with cancer, your loved ones might be diagnosed with cancer. The older they are when they have cancer, the greater the probability that they may not be able to endure the treatment. And so it becomes harder to treat cancer in a healthy way that doesn't have significant side effects and impact on their functioning. The big one is heart disease. Cancer's like scary as fuck for me, if I'm being honest, because I'm a cancer survivor. But the greater risk is heart disease, even in my family, where so many of my loved ones died before 50 or in their early 50s. And like many families, heart disease is a leading cause of death in this developmental period. And so I know it's not just my family, and those are all things we have to consider and why it's important to take care of ourselves as best as possible. Other chronic diseases, as I mentioned, arthritis, which is an inflammatory disease. A significant chunk of our people in late adulthood report having arthritis, which impacts their mobility, their comfort level, their peace, and just their activities of daily living. Osteoporosis, where those bones actually are weakened and thinned out, the mass and substance of the bones deteriorates. Again, most commonly impacts women. It's really interesting because this can lead to falls, and a broken hip is often the marker where physical health declines. And when people break a hip, they're at greater risk of death. So it's important to know. Kyphosis, when you actually start to see people hunching over, they lose that height as a result of that bone loss. COPD, impacting their breathing, often as a result of smoking. Shingles, which is a virus that stays in our system after having been exposed to chickenpox, and this predominantly affects individuals in late adulthood. They do have an immunization and vaccination that you can get for shingles. And in fact, they have a whole series of vaccinations for individuals, that some 50 and older, some 55 and older, some 60 and older. But it's important that your loved ones or you are talking to your doctors to make sure you're getting the appropriate vaccinations. And then here's some other conditions that are more common in late adulthood. Other ways that we might see and observe physical decline is what's happening with our brains. Our brains are literally shrinking. We are literally losing axons, and we are losing that white matter, that gray matter. And consequently, our brain functioning declines as well. Those connections are not as strong. Those pathways are not as strong. And so there is this scaffolding process that takes place where we have this atrophy, we have this cellular decline and death. But what our brains then do is they compensate by creating other connections with remaining tissue that's there. So the loss of this extra tissue, can still be compensated for through these connections with the tissue that's remaining. You can also actively engage in like brain games that keep your brain stimulated, that encourage those synaptic connections, and that help to protect your cognitive functioning over time. And so being, healthy nutrition, being physically active, right? Maintaining a healthy physical regimen, and then additionally exercising that brain by engaging in mental activities, and then maintaining a healthy social life. All of those things help to preserve your brain functioning. And then another neurological condition that does increase with age is Parkinson's. This is a neurological condition. We see a lot of the physical symptoms, including the shaking and the tremors. Michael J. Fox is a very notable person that represents Parkinson's disease. It's a neural decline. There is a genetic risk in families. So your family health history is really important. And it's a result of your dopamine production. And so really important if you have Parkinson's in your family. Again, they have treatments not to cure Parkinson's, but to lessen the progression or slow the progression of the disease and lessen the symptoms as best as possible. The sooner you get on that regimen, the better. Sleep also changes with age. So interestingly enough, our circadian rhythm changes at different stages of our life, right? In different developmental periods. And at this period, we face advanced sleep phase syndrome. You might see that older individuals they have an early bedtime and an early rise time. And that's just a natural part of their circadian rhythm shift. They might actually experience heightened risk of insomnia, sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, all these sleep disturbances. So trouble falling asleep and trouble staying asleep, right? And whether, even when we're in rapid eye movement, theoretically, our muscles are supposed to be, we're supposed to, gosh, what is the word I'm trying to think of? But we're not supposed to have any muscle control or movement in REM. But when we have this REM sleep behavior disorder, our muscles are still moving during REM, which means that we don't get that peaceful, restful sleep. And so, again, what can we do? Exercise, healthy nutrition, good quality social life, right? Managing our stress. And then another area of our physical development that warrants conversation is our sexuality. Many people historically have thought that older people aren't sexual creatures. Not true. Particularly as we watch this, the baby boomers actually were part of the sexual revolution, right? They're probably our most sexually empowered cohort to date. And so they're certainly continuing to have sex into late adulthood. And, presuming they are physically capable, they are typically remaining sexually active. The challenge is, as their risk of disease increase, it impacts their sexual functioning, right? They have different hormonal changes that are impacting their sexual function. And so you might see some declines, but that doesn't mean that they aren't still having sex. And so important to consider good quality sex education, because they also come from a generation that didn't necessarily talk about these things publicly. So they need really good sex education, particularly as they're moving into long-term care facilities where they are more sexually active. They have access to Viagra and other types of drugs to support their sexual functioning and health well into late adulthood. So they need to be having safer sex and having healthy, open dialogue about sex. Okay, this might be a good place to stop. This is our cognitive development section. And so we're going to look at mental functioning and some of the terms that you may have addressed in middle adulthood will come into play as well, particularly as we look at the different types of memory and intelligence. So pretty much memory declines. Right? So our working memory declines. Think about working memory as active processing. So the common theme you're going to see is our knowledge base can maintain strength in some areas, but our speed with which we're able to process information declines. And working memory is about actively processing information. And so that does decline. Divided attention declines. So it's harder for us to focus. It's harder for us to do multiple things at once. It's harder for us to focus for extended periods of time. And we need more time to process information as we age. So we do see declines in working memory. We also see declines more so in our episodic memory, so our autobiographical memory, over our knowledge-based memory, our semantic memory. More likely to struggle with tip of the tongue, right? Like we just can't retrieve. Who is that actor that is in the Broadway show right now who colored his hair? Oh, George Clooney, right? So we often have more retrieval barriers. Implicit memory actually seems to be pretty strong. Our implicit memory is that behind the scenes memory, such as our motor memory and such, and we're very vulnerable to priming. So think about priming as like unconscious preparation that's happening for us to respond or perceive a certain way, which actually may make sense why older individuals are more prone to things like fake news or deep fakes, and maybe sucked into, kind of flashy politics, because they are more susceptible to priming. Our perspective memory, so think about like, oh, I have this date, I have this event on this date. Those types of things decline as well. And then, of course, when you talk about recall versus recognition, so recall is when you can pull information with more of a general cue, kind of like an essay test. And recognition is where you have specific cues that alert you or prompt you to that information. And that's more like a multiple choice test. Everybody across life expectancy, across developmental periods, they do better with recognition than recall. Recognition is easier than recall. But for late adulthood, their recall is significantly slower or lower than that of other developmental periods. So they have particular deficits to recall that other developmental periods don't. Again, attention, harder, focusing attention, harder. That's what we would call selective attention, harder with divided attention, or what you would call multitasking. And that processing speed. We need more time to process information. Thus, our reaction time slows for driving. Thus, we might need more time in having a conversation. Our problem solving, it's not that we're not intelligent and we can't figure things out. We just need more time. So what that means for you is you need to be more patient, right? You need to be more patient. Give them the time. Don't push them aside and take over a transaction for them. Give them that space and the time to figure it out, because the more you do it for them, the more you're taking that exercise and practice potential away from their brain, and then the more declines they experience. So just give them space and time and patience, and give them that opportunity to figure it out. We really have a harder time inhibiting information that's not important, right? So much of our cognitive functioning is about filtering out extraneous information around us, and that becomes harder for us as we age. And additionally, when you tell us something you don't want us to know and say, oh, forget I said that. Yeah, well, now we become fixated on it. Everybody at all age periods actually has greater memory for information, incorrect information, than correct information. So if someone explains something to you and say, oh, I made a mistake, you're more likely to remember the mistake than you are the correction. And that just continues to increase with age. Now, memory is different than intelligence. Certainly, it might impact intelligence, but it's different than intelligence, right? And so crystallized intelligence is like a body of knowledge that we hold, our vocabulary, right? The stuff that we know, that actually maintains, a pretty strong level of functioning into late adulthood. But again, that speed, that time, that fluid intelligence, which is that problem solving on the fly, that slows. And so you may think that they are forgetful or they've lost access to their knowledge. They might just need more time to access that information. One area that we do see improve is pragmatics of intelligence. So when we're talking about cultural elements, how to, what are the cultural appropriate responses or processes or traditions or values? Those actually can be maintained like crystallized intelligence, which is often why you see many cultures looking to their elders as a huge source of cultural knowledge and passing on those cultural traditions. Mechanics, which is another way of looking at the functioning, right? Similar to fluid intelligence, it has declined. And then wisdom. Wisdom is something that accumulates with age based on life experience, whether it's in a workforce environment, whether it's in a family, cultural, social environment. That's when we can really make good, sound, reasoned decisions. Our judgment improves, right? And we make better decisions. And we're considering other information that maybe younger generations don't have. They haven't had that experience, so they have a little bit more limitations in the knowledge and experience by which they can make an informed, sound judgment. Sadly, beyond just general normative declines, you also have increased risk of specific neurocognitive disorders as we age. Now, these are disorders that actually have diagnostic criteria in the DSM, so you can be diagnosed by a practicing therapist, psychologist, or you can be diagnosed by a medical practitioner, right, an MD or an OD. So major neurocognitive disorders represent significant cognitive declines. So you can see observable declines in their cognitive reasoning and performance. They may not be able to notice and acknowledge the personal declines that they're experiencing, but certainly third parties, family members can often report those. You can also have minor neurocognitive disorders where you're seeing some cognitive decline, but it's not major. It's not a huge deficit. And it may be a little bit more subtle and harder to notice, but it's still observable. Some examples are down here. We'll also cover them individually. Alzheimer's is one of the most common, and your risk increases with age. It's the 6th leading cause of death in the US, 5th for people over 65. When you talk about all the neurocognitive disorders, it accounts for about half of them. And what you see with Alzheimer's disease is you see changes in their memory function, memory loss, and you also see changes in their personality, often with them becoming a little bit more irritated, frustrated, apprehensive, and it progressively deteriorates over time. Once someone is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, now they may actually have been experiencing Alzheimer's for several years prior, but once they're diagnosed, on average, they live about 8 years. This is a terminal disease. Most people don't realize this. It's not just a functional disease. It literally is the result of deteriorating brain matter. And so consequently, it does in fact result in death. And other risk factors associated with it, of course, genetics, traumatic brain injury, recurrent traumatic brain injury, obesity, hypertension, high cholesterol, and diabetes. Vascular neurocognitive disorders. So when we're talking about vascular, we're talking about the veins, the arterial systems throughout the body. And so this is the second most common. It also increases with age. 80 seems to be when the majority of people are impacted. So effectively, the vascular breakdown, of course, your brain demands a tremendous amount of energy and oxygen. And so any kind of vascular blockages or obstructions can impact your cognitive functioning as a result in your brain functioning. This actually is more likely to result in an acute death. Rather than the slow deterioration, this often is a more accelerated process. Lewy body is when you have these proteins and that negatively impacts your brain. It's the third most common, and then again increases with age, usually diagnosed about 5 to 7 years prior to passing. So here's just some common risk factors to think about for vascular neurocognitive disorders. Again, healthy diet, healthy physical activity, healthy social and emotional engagement. All of those things are protective factors. Here's some symptoms to consider as Lewy body dementia progresses as well. So another area that impacts our cognitive functioning is work and retirement, right? And so most people think about, when you're in late adulthood, you stop working, you retire. And we'd love to think that that's a possibility. However, more and more people are working well into late adulthood, most often because they financially cannot afford to retire. If you think Social Security is sufficient to take care of you in retirement, yeah, it's not, right? And it also is not an entitlement. It's a system that you pay into, and our government is entrusted with investing those dollars, protecting that investment, and ensuring that it continues to be available to support you in retirement. Sadly, many people only have access to Social Security, and that becomes a detriment, which is why people in late adulthood are at increased risk of poverty. Consequently, you find that most people might retire, but they really kind of retire from full-time, and they have these bridge jobs where they might be doing something part-time or something in a related career. A lot of people retire and then end up having to get a job to supplement their income because their retirement income is just not sufficient. More and more people are delaying retirement altogether because they financially cannot afford to retire. They need extended health benefits. Medicare is not available till you're 65, or maybe it won't be available at all by the time I'm 65. We'll wait and see how that goes. But that being said, many people need to work well into late adulthood, and that is the time where they're facing more workplace discrimination. We know these cognitive declines exist, and ageism is definitely real in American society. So these individuals might need to work, but they're less likely to secure jobs. And they might also be competing with a younger population that needs to work as well. So for all these reasons, it's a very fragile time in the lifespan, and socially we need to consider how we're going to support this rapidly aging population of ours. So some theories have actually broken down retirement into a number of stages, where they move from fantasizing in a remote stage to really defining concrete plans when they're going to retire, what it's going to look like. Then they actually do retire. And immediately after retirement, just as with marriage, they have a honeymoon phase and they're off enjoying and traveling and living their best life. But they may eventually reach a disenchantment phase where they might feel, emotionally let down. They might feel a little bit more socially disengaged. They might feel like their sense of worth and purpose has declined. And so they need to go through a period of reorienting and kind of figuring out a new sense of purpose. I did retirement planning in my former career as a financial advisor. And we always said you've got to retire to something, not from something. So it's important to have a sense of purpose and meaning. It's important to have activities with which you can engage in a meaningful, substantive way well after you move away from working. How do you support a long, healthy life after retirement? Stay active. Stay busy, stay engaged, make sure you're maintaining those social connections and continue to be a productive part of society. Volunteering, going to school, getting educated, sometimes having hobbies that you run as careers, as your side gigs, so to speak. All great ways for seniors to stay active and thriving. Okay, beyond thriving cognitively, let's talk about how we experience social and emotional developmental changes and how we can promote health and well-being in those areas. Sadly, as we talked about, in America, we face ageism, a prejudice against the elderly. Now, this might vary, right? Depending upon your culture, some cultures really value the elderly and they are revered and respected. And so always note that there are cultural differences, but it is important to note that ageism exists, right? And so we need to acknowledge that. If I'm competing with a 40-year-old for a job or a 35-year-old for a job as a 55 or a 65-year-old woman, I'm less likely to get the job. I'm more likely to be perceived as less reliable, less competent, blah, 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 blah. So those negative stereotypes very much matter. They also matter because they affect what I think of myself. And so I can engage in a self-fulfilling prophecy if I have negative views of aging, if I have expectations of decline. I can actually see declines in my abilities just because I believe I'm going to decline. And then there's stereotype threat where I internalize those stereotypes and those biases and those prejudices, and they negatively affect how I perceive myself and how capable I see myself as being, which then impacts my functioning as well. So all of this negativity, this stigma, has an impact on us individually and as a larger society as a whole. Then there's those that not only face ageism, they face racism, they face sexism, right? So when we talk about minorities, we're talking about marginalized communities that historically have been viewed as less than, less capable, less intelligent, less worthy. And so elderly individuals are often perceived that way, particularly in an individualistic society that values productivity, economic prosperity, independence, that type of thing. And then our communities of color historically have faced tremendous discrimination over their lifespan. So an elderly Black man experiences a different degree of prejudice and bias than an elderly white man, right? And so what we see, and they also have less access to quality health care. And so we do see that those intersectional risks have a compounding risk. Imagine that for an aging woman of color, right? So now you have that intersection of racism, sexism, and ageism. Sadly, this absolutely manifests itself in our poverty rates. Older women are more likely to be in poverty than older men. Older people of color are more likely to be in poverty than white older individuals, and certainly white elderly people of color are at greater risk of experiencing poverty. And so those rates are outlined here as well. So part of our social and emotional development is where we live, who we live with, right? The majority of elderly individuals, 65 or older, are living with their spouses, right? Now, because men are more likely to die at earlier ages, more women are living alone. So men are more likely to welcome a new marriage and repartner. And in fact, they often do so, within 18 months of their spouse passing away. Women are more likely to live alone and remain alone after their partners pass away. Sadly, those that do live alone, only a small percentage report being comfortable. The others typically don't have enough to meet their needs, or they're barely making it from paycheck to paycheck. And because women live longer, they make up the majority of the aging population. And so we need to take those things into consideration. They are more likely to live with children and family members as a result. So when you're living with family, we see this more common, multi-generational households among communities of color. Often it's related to their cultural values, but it does serve a financial benefit and a social benefit. Very few individuals want to move into retirement. Maybe at retirement they move to a more affordable place, but typically research actually shows that there's an increased risk of death when they move from an area where they're familiar and most comfortable. But those that do move often are moving so they can be close to family members. That gives them greater access, particularly if they've lived with quite some distance between them and their families. We do see more and more becoming residents of like long-term care facilities, assisted living facilities. We'll probably see those rates increasing as that baby boomer generation is increasing as well. We will see a greater demand for nursing homes, assisted living, transitional care, that type of thing. Now, how do we differentiate between assisted living and nursing home? A nursing home, they're typically reliant 100% on the care of nursing staff, whereas assisted living, they might have some support like with medication administration or with cooking, but they typically have independent living spaces, and then they can join in on common living spaces and also different services that facilities might provide on a gradual basis to supplement their needs as their needs might change and evolve over time. It is important to note that long-term care insurance can be really valuable at helping to provide for needs. When we talk about Medicaid, which is available at 65 or older, it does not cover stays in long-term care, or the quality of care is significantly lower in Medicaid facilities than it is in facilities that take a range of long-term care insurance. So if there is an opportunity to get long-term care insurance, ideally in early adulthood, middle adulthood, when it's still more affordable, then it's highly recommended by financial professionals. One of the triggers for the activation of benefits of long-term care is activities of daily living. Some policies say, when you can't meet when you have three needs of activities of daily living. So in other words, you cannot do these things for yourself. You need help bathing or toileting or getting dressed or walking or eating or just caring for your personal hygiene. If you need help with three or more of these things, typically your long-term care insurance activates. There has to be this criteria because it's not like life insurance where death is the activator, and that's a very clear, definitive yes, there's a need, right? Activities of daily living allow a more objective assessment of do you need to be in a nursing facility? Do you need that professional support and assistance? There's also instrumental activities of daily living, some really quality long-term care insurance, which is typically more expensive, will kick in if you can't meet some of these IADLs. So you need help just doing laundry or household chores or things of that nature. Cooking, not just eating, but preparing those meals, shopping, those things. Then when you need those types of assistance, your long-term care insurance might kick in. So understanding activities of daily living, understanding that these types of functions impact our quality of life, and they're indicators that one's independence is declining and the need for additional support and assistance, whether it's professional or personal, is needed. So let's move into Erikson. So our final stage of Erikson's theory is integrity versus despair. So at this point in time, wisdom is a huge theme in late adulthood. This is a time period where individuals are looking back on their life and they can feel a sense of integrity, a life well lived. I did a good job. I'm leaving behind a good legacy. I may have made mistakes, but I did the best that I could, and I'm still, leaving a positive impact on the world. Versus somebody that's looking back and may have a life filled with regrets, a life filled with maybe broken bridges, empty promises. Maybe they never pursued their dreams, passion. They didn't feel they lived a life of purpose, meaning, significance. They don't feel like they had good social quality relationships. They might feel despair. These things impact whether or not I embrace death in a healthy, peaceful way. Somebody that's in a state of despair might look forward to death in a sense that it's going to relieve them of their tormented life, but they're not going to be at peace necessarily with their death. Somebody that has integrity is in a state of acceptance. They're ready. They feel good about the life they lived and the choices that they made, and they feel like they lived a meaningful, valuable, purposeful life. So this really is about how they're reflecting retrospectively on the life that they lived and on the meaning and purpose and value that they offered while they were here. Another theory that's important to consider for social and emotional development is activity theory. This theory suggests that the more active we are, the more sense of well-being and life satisfaction we have. So being active, being physically active and engaged, being out there in the world, volunteering, working for charities. I went to the zoo recently, and sure enough, like the majority of volunteers are well into late adulthood. It allows them to engage in activities that they enjoy. It gives them access to things that they like, but it also gives them really valuable social engagement as well. So many people get involved in faith-based activities during this time. So heavy involvement with churches and religious organizations. Many people find their sense of meaning and purpose through, helping to raise their grandchildren. And so however they're actively engaging the world doesn't matter as long as they're active and engaged. There's also the convoy model of social relations that breaks up your social connections into an inner circle, middle circle, and outer circle. And it gets progressively closer the more it gets to the inside, closer to you. So your inner circle is the most prized circle. Those are the people that are important to your everyday life and your overall well-being and functioning. You're close to them. They become your allies, your confidants. confidants, your resources. These tend to be really stable relationships well into late adulthood. Now, the middle circle, I'm close to these people. They may not be as important for my daily functioning, right? They may not be as important for me and for my well-being, but they tend to be stable. The outer relationships, not so much. It might be part of my life, but I'm not as close to them. It might be, a neighbor up the street that I say hi to when I walk, versus my neighbor that is my best friend and my confidant, right? The socio-emotional selectivity theory suggests that I actually switch my prioritization of relationships. So networks start to get smaller. I start to prioritize quality relationships over quantity of relationships. So I have limited capacity. So I'm going to invest that capacity into those closer, more prized relationships. And I'm going to really avoid and select out toxicity, like negativity, things that don't support my social and emotional well-being. Yeah, I'm going to reduce those negative interactions, and I'm going to focus on the relationships that I have positive interactions with. In terms of relationships, sometimes the closest confidant and resource becomes the adult children. And you may have heard like the flipping of the roles, right? Where now the children become the caretakers. And so interestingly enough, the adults that are more, the children, adult children that are more independent financially and otherwise, they actually have the healthiest relationship with their aging parents. So we tend to be closer to our children that are more independent, more emotionally stable, obviously that we have connections with and we have meaningful relationships with. We have a greater life satisfaction when we have those types of connections with our children. But when you are still financially taking care of your children, even as adults, that can put a strain on a relationship. When you are responsible for raising your grandchildren and financially providing for your grandchildren, that can put a strain on a relationship. So one of the key things about having healthy relationships between aging parents and their adult children is that independence, is that stability. Friendships, typically you need 1-2 close friends, but when they pass away, right, it's good to have a network. But friends continue to be important throughout our lives, particularly for women, particularly as they become widows and their husbands pass away. There is a risk of loneliness and solitude, again, more for women when they're socially isolated after their husbands pass. Men can be emotionally isolated. We want to do our best to keep our elderly loved ones engaged socially and emotionally, keep them in the fold, make sure they're getting health care, make sure they have those hearing aids and the devices they need to continue to be engaged in family functions and continue to feel like they're a meaningful part of that family network. In terms of lifestyle, most are, married until their loved one passes away, at which time they experience widowhood, more common in women than men. Of course, particularly if you've been married to someone for a long time, of course you're going to feel lonely. Of course it can be devastating. I just watched my cousin lose her husband of nearly 50 years. That's a lifespan, right? And so it's really important to wrap our arms around our loved ones who've lost their significant other, and recognize their risk of death now significantly increases. That's what we call the widowhood mortality index. Once one spouse passes away, the risk of the other spouse passing away increases significantly. Even in late adulthood, divorce still happens. I wonder why. It doesn't make sense financially, right? But But although it's not as common in earlier years, it still happens. Really important that the family is taking care of, particularly the women who may not have the financial resources to live on their own. Believe it or not, dating apps for elderly people are in demand, right? That becomes the most common means by which people date and meet new prospective partners, either from post divorce or post widowhood. And typically, it's about 18 months after they've lost a spouse. Some of them might not even be looking for a partner, they might just be looking for social connection, and that's okay. And again, sex education. I should do a sex ed workshop and sell it to Match or Our Time. I might have a side gig there. And then remarriage. When you remarry at older ages, you're more likely to stay with your partner. Of course, it's a shorter period of time, right? But also just think about the maturity involved, right? Like you're more realistic. I swear I could do a whole comedy routine on dating in middle adulthood, and I'm sure that just becomes more hilarious into late adulthood. We'll see whether I settle down or whether I go on tour with my comedy routine. But you definitely become more realistic dating in in middle and late adulthood. And then, of course, it's important to consider our LGBTQ relationships, right? Where these individuals may have experienced discrimination throughout their entire lifespan, many of them facing ageism, racism, sexism, and then, of course, homophobia and potentially transphobia as well. And so these individuals are resilient and strong, but they still need our acceptance, our love, our support. Um, and we have to recognize the long term impact of all the prejudice and discrimination they've felt. And when religion and spirituality becomes really important in this life stage, this community has often been excluded from religion. And so it is important for them to have some spiritual outlets and access. And it is important that they continue to have social support. And then finally, we have to talk about elder abuse. So there's a child protective services and there's an adult protective services. Sadly, 10% of our elderly population suffers some type of abuse. Often it's women more likely to be abused than men, just like at any stage of life. Sadly, who is most likely to be the abuser? A family member, often the family member that's doing the caretaking. Often it's the children. Remember, I talked about those adult children that are still dependent, where the elderly parents are financially supporting them or taking care of them. They are more likely to abuse their parent, which is a little twisted, right? You would think they'd be grateful and appreciative. No, they're at greatest risk of abusing their children. Maybe a sense of, or their aging parents. Maybe it's a sense of entitlement. Maybe it's boundaries, whatever it might be. But quite often, if there's other risk factors like substance abuse or mental illness or chronic unemployment, those things only heighten the risk and increase the risk of them abusing their parents. Whether it's physical abuse and physically hitting them and harming them, emotional abuse and calling them names and verbally attacking them. Sexual abuse does happen. Most often that happens in facilities, or financial exploitation. Financial abuse is really common with children who are dependent. Maybe it's neglect and not caring for their needs at all, or maybe it's completely abandoning them and leaving them with no access to support and resources. Sadly, many of you might be like me, where you have a parent that refuses help. You have a parent that refuses support, financially, physically, emotionally, or otherwise. And sadly, that stubbornness and that resistance is a barrier. So I have to tell my mom, you're going to get me in trouble for neglect, right? But, sadly, she's cognitively still able to make her own decisions, and I don't have a case. But I hope someday she'll be receptive to support. Again, wrap your loved ones in support. At this stage, they are at risk of becoming substance abusers. Um, Sometimes they may have experienced a surgery or an accident. They go on a prescription medication for a pain reliever, and that might cause them to become dependent, or they use alcohol to numb the pain. Sometimes it's about numbing emotional and social pain, not just physical pain. So you see commonly their risk of substance abuse increases after they've experienced the death of a loved one, even after retirement, that major life change, or they moved from their hometown to a new area. They're lonely, right? They may not have the social connections, the resource, the familiarity, and it can be scary going out and navigating new spaces. Or maybe they have deteriorating health conditions. Either way, it's so, so, so important to keep them plugged in, to keep them wrapped in support. So, how do we make sure our loved ones age successfully? Keep them healthy. We want them to avoid disease as best as possible. We want them to maintain a healthy diet, an active physical lifestyle, active cognitively, whether it's engaging in brain games, puzzles, or that social interaction, conversation, dialogue, volunteering, having things that stimulate their mind and their body. And they engage in what's called selective optimization with compensation. They know their strengths and they know their weaknesses. They can outsource the weaknesses. I don't want to get on my hands and knees and clean the house, so I'm going to hire a housekeeper. But I'm going to focus on cooking with my grandchildren because it gives me purpose and passion and meaning to pass on those family recipes and to build those memories in the kitchen. Whatever it might be, they know their strengths, they lean into those, and they outsource their weaknesses. And that's selective optimization with compensation, helping them to make sure that you're there to support them, to be a means of compensation, to be a means of optimization can be a valuable resource to help your loved ones age successfully. And on that note, I will leave you with some words of wisdom from David Bowie. Aging is an extraordinary process where you become the person you always should have been. And Frank Lloyd Wright, the longer I live, the more beautiful it becomes. And with that, I shall say much love and aloha to you and all your loved ones. Mahalo.